Hello friends and fellow book nerds, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited. Today we are chatting about all of my favorite books from 2024. So when I was compiling this list and making my notes, I did notice that I only have 4 of these books physically, which is really a testament to how much I loved my Kindle this year. Most of the books that I read, a lot of my favorites were Libby loans through my library or Kindle Unlimited reads. It just goes to show you can read a lot of really great books without spending a ton of money. We are just going to jump right into it because I have a lot of books to chat about. So the way I am doing this is I'm taking a handful, not quite all of my 4 stars, but the 4 stars that I wanted to mention that really stuck out to me that I feel like were in the top end of my 4 stars, because to be honest, if I like a book a lot, it's going to usually get a 4 star. My 5 stars are quite reserved for the best of the best. These are generally in order from least to most favorite. So we are starting off with a YA dystopian sci-fi. This year I started the Red Rising series by Pierce Brown. This is set on future Mars, where a young man who is part of the lowest red class basically infiltrates the elite gold class to try and dismantle the system of oppression. I love that premise. While it's not one of the most unique premises, especially in YA dystopian sci-fi specifically, it's giving very much inspired by other books of the genre. But honestly, I don't mind that because I did find it to be engaging enough, and there were some aspects of this that were unique enough for me to be interested. I love a space setting. There's a lot of like interplanetary travel in this, which was really fun and interesting. I did enjoy the first one more than the second one, which I also read. After the second one, I didn't continue the series, but I'm definitely going to. It is a really fun sci-fi, especially kind of an easy entry point if you're wanting to get into it. Next, we have the only thriller on this list. This is None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. I read this with a friend book club that I am in, and everyone really enjoyed it. I do tend to read a handful of thrillers every year, and the ones that I pick, I have to say, I do quite enjoy. They're just never my favorite 5 stars. None of This Is True is a psychological thriller, which is absolutely my favorite. I also really love psychological thriller movies. This one's about 2 women who share the same birthday. They meet in a bar, and one of them is this kind of mysterious, troubled woman who convinces the other, who has her own kind of true crime women-centric story podcast, to do a series on her life. As the title suggests, there's a lot of unreliable narration going on here, multiple POVs, so you kind of go through the whole story with a sense of skepticism and suspicion of a lot of the different characters. You don't really know what's going on, what's the truth. I personally really enjoyed that. It makes for quite an interesting and thrilling read. Next, we are chatting about a spicy romance series. This is the Never After series by Emily McIntyre, specifically Wretched and Twisted. Those were the 2 that I read this year. They got 4 stars from me. This series, if you're not aware, is called the Fractured Fairy Tale series. Essentially, every book is a standalone inspired by a fairy tale or folklore type of story. A lot of like Disney princess type of vibes here. So these ones specifically surprised me because Wretched is loosely based on The Wizard of Oz, and Twisted is loosely based on Aladdin, and neither of those are any of my favorite type of fantasy stories by any means. But for whatever reason, I really enjoyed the character dynamics and the way that Emily McIntyre took these plots for the story. I also thought the spice was very good in both of these. They're just quick reads. I fly through these. I just find them really fun and interesting. Wretched is like, it's an undercover DEA agent, falls for a notorious drug lord, basically. Twisted is the typical Jasmine. She is like the heiress of this very successful but sketchy diamond businessman who falls for one of her dad's employees. I just really enjoyed both of those dynamics, and those were definitely 2 of my favorite like kind of spicy romances of the year. Speaking of spicy romance, another one that I really enjoyed was Phantasma, which was a paranormal kind of dark romance. Dark romance is definitely where I skew on the romance scale. This one I picked up on Kindle Unlimited just on a whim, and I really enjoyed it. Heavy on the caraval vibes, but in a more spooky, haunted setting. So it takes place in a haunted manor where one time a year there is this like dark magical competition. In this case, what I really enjoyed was that the young woman in this one was a necromancer, and she goes into this competition and, you guessed it, falls for the really old but looks young, morally gray, eternal, magical figure. In this case, he's a phantom, Really love that dynamic. He also gave me very Jax vibes. If you're familiar with Once Upon a Broken Heart, he was Jax, but just in another universe. I really love A Magical Trial. I enjoyed the setting in this one a lot. I think that there was a lot of cool descriptions. I felt very real, and I'm excited to read the sequel that comes out, I believe, this April. So speaking of Caraval, that is on this list. I did read the entire Caraval and Once Upon a Broken Heart series this year, and absolutely had the time of my life reading all of them, some more than others. Again, similar to Phantasma, where there is a once a year very magical event, but this one is more heavy on the carnival fantasy fairy tale vibes and less on the gruesome, creepy, dark vibes. Very over the top, you know, candy, treats, magicians. The difference is that Caraval is more of a once a year performance put on by this ringleader called Legend. Two sisters are kind of intertwined in the story. Very over the top. I just love fantasy and fairy tale so much, and I feel like this one is just that, but amped up to a level of almost like it's ridiculous, but I personally really like that. The plot, to be honest, does get quite messy and convoluted, not necessarily the most well done plot execution in the world, but honestly, I was just here for the drama, the descriptions of these kind of parties and ball gowns and treats and outfits, and just everything is so grandiose that I just really loved it. The first and second were definitely better in my opinion. The last one was a huge mess, but honestly, I love drama. I love a love triangle. And again, I really love the fantasy elements of this, so it got a pass, just not quite 5 stars. However, something that was 5 stars was one of the books in this next series, which is Once Upon a Broken Heart. So I'm just talking about it here in the 4-star category, but we're getting up to the top, like the best of the 4 stars. So to me, that's the Once Upon a Broken Heart series. Both of these were by Stephanie Garber, by the way. This is a spin-off / continuation. I'm sorry that the lighting is kind of going crazy right now, by the way. It is a very like stormy, windy day, and the clouds and sun is kind of moving around. This is a spin-off of the Caraval series, almost even more absurd and crazy and fever dream-like than Caraval, and I was just obsessed with it. Like I mentioned before, Jax, the kind of main male character in this one, toxic, morally gray, giving very Gemini in my opinion, type of main character. I was absolutely obsessed with him. It is even more of that really over-the-top, saturated, sickly, sweet type of setting, with castles and parties and pink tulle sparkly dresses, and the main character has like pink hair. It's just so Disney fairy tale, glitter, glam, drama. So this one gives the backstory to Jax, one of the kind of minor characters in Caraval. So essentially Jax is the cursed prince of hearts who is fated to kill every girl that he kisses. And as you can imagine, he is very charming, very handsome. So he ends up kissing quite a few girls in his very long eternal life. And so you're getting the story of Evangeline Fox, the main young girl character, who gets intertwined into his magical story. These read very, very YA, but honestly, because the setting and the fantasy elements were so fun, in my opinion, I didn't mind it. Speaking of fantasy, we're going into a more adult fantasy series that I really, really love this year. These are actually some of the books that I have physically, and that is Godkiller and the sequel Sunbringer. I did enjoy Godkiller, the first one, a bit more, but I absolutely loved the world and the magic systems of this. This one definitely has a more serious adult vibe. The main character, Kissin, in this is a Godkiller, and I believe she's in her like late 20s, 30s. So I personally enjoyed that, bit more relevant to me in my age group. The fantasy in this is also definitely much more intricate. The magic and fantasy is very, very heavily based in mythology and folklore, which I love so much. It's one of my favorite aspects of fantasy. So in this world, there are various gods with differing moral compasses and levels of power and forms. So the main character, Kissin, in this is obviously a god killer. She finds herself on this kind of magical quest. She goes around killing the gods who are causing trouble and the more nasty evil ones. So she's essentially on a path for vengeance because a god killed her whole family and left her disabled as well. On this kind of journey she's taking, she finds herself as the kind of guardian of this young noble girl who is lost and needs, you know, guidance and all of that. And the young girl is also tied to a little mini god who is like the cutest thing ever, which is inspired by a folklore type of god. I think it's a cross between a hare, a stag, and something that can fly. I honestly don't quite remember. So this world is like on the brink of war. They're on this epic quest. All these different things are happening. So there's a lot going on. I just really loved all the mythology, inspiration, and references here. I also love that you get multiple POVs. I mentioned that quite a lot. I love a multiple POV. My issue with the second one was that we didn't get quite as much of the POV of the main character in this one, who I really enjoyed, and I got more POV of character that I didn't quite care about. I also felt the plot, the way that this one went was a little bit confusing, a little bit dragged on. Still a 4-star, still really excited to continue this series. If you want something that's more mythology and more adult fantasy, highly, highly recommend. So next on this list is more fantasy. Is anyone surprised? We have Bookshops and Bonedust, which was the prequel to Legends and Lattes, which was one of my favorite reads, I believe last year when I read it. That's a 5-star for me, and this one just didn't quite hit as hard as Legends and Lattes. This is one where I initially rated it 5 stars, but the more that I read that year, the more when I was looking back on this list and evaluating my ratings, I dropped it down to a 4, and I do that quite a lot. I just feel like when you get more perspective, when you read other things, you're like, well, if that's a 5, then this isn't a 5. This one was still a really good cozy fantasy, as the name suggests. Lots of bookshops, lots of coffee still, lots of magical creatures kind of sitting around chatting, talking about their lives and their stories, and just very, very wholesome. I listened to this on audiobook, which was actually narrated by the author themselves. Same thing with Legends and Lattes, and I just feel like they do such a good job. I really enjoy that aspect of these, so I highly recommend the audiobooks as well. While I do want to get these on the special editions that I have seen going around, they're so pretty. People say that these are low stakes, and they are for a fantasy, definitely. However, I still feel like there's enough conflict and interesting story and kind of, you know, bad guys that people have to deal with that they're still interesting and intriguing to read. So I don't think they're too low stakes where they're boring and nothing happens. I still really enjoy them. Definitely a cozy time. Highly recommend. Okay, we are officially at the end of the 4 stars. This one is a 4.5 for me. Was almost a 5-star, and honestly, in another universe it definitely could have been. The 4.5 just felt right to me, so that's what this is. And this is a Greek mythology. This is Atalanta by Jennifer Saint. I was one of those children, as many millennials are, who was obsessed with Greek mythology growing up, and Atalanta was one that I had never really heard of before. So I was very excited to pick this one up, and what a surprise it was. This was such an interesting story, very much a strong woman-centric story, which I love. I also read Electra by Jennifer Saint this year. Didn't enjoy that one as much. Electra is one of the most insufferable characters I have ever read about, and I have read all of Sarah J. Maas's books. Atalanta in Greek mythology is traditionally one where there's kind of 2 different stories that she's involved in, and I feel like Jennifer Saint combined them, created this whole story that made so much sense, that was done so flawlessly that I just ate it up. I loved it. Atalanta is a story of a woman who was abandoned at birth by her father, who wanted a son, and so then she was discovered and was taken care of by initially various creatures of the forest, like bears and nymphs and things like that, and then she was taken in by a group of hunters. The overarching kind of theme is that Artemis, who is what? The goddess of, not love, that's Aphrodite. Artemis, goddess of chastity, hunting in the moon. That's right, because Artemis's whole thing, her one rule is that you never lay with a man. So her entire kind of tribe is all nymphs, all women, and they're all virgins. Atalanta is raised to be this hunter, this super strong woman who is raised with other women, the forest, nature, things like that. And Artemis essentially trains her and raises her up, and then eventually sends her out on this expedition to basically prove herself and show, you know, her strength, show what Artemis can do. You're getting a lot of the setting of Atalanta growing up in nature, but also this epic quest where she's literally on a boat full of nothing but men, and she has to protect herself, prove herself. You know, she kind of falls in love along the way. She faces obviously a lot of discrimination and abuse along the way because of course. I just think it's such a beautiful story of the resilience and strength and duality and beauty of women. I think I still have Hera to read by Jennifer Saint, but I will be reading everything she does because I just think it was so amazing. We're officially into the 5 stars of 2024. And first we're starting off with one that was a little bit hard for me to rate because I feel like rating memoirs is it just feels a little bit strange to rate someone's true life experience and engage if their trauma was entertaining enough for you. I just feel like that's kind of a weird space to be in with reading. However, this one is an exception because this is Britney Spears' memoir, The Woman in Me. Britney is just like many others. She is everything to me. She's my OG pop princess. I grew up on her music. I had all of her posters on my wall. Baby One More Time was my first album on cassette. The pink cassette I got in my stocking for Christmas. I just remember it all so vividly. She's just such an important part of my childhood and my music taste to this day. And her story is just one that's obviously still so relevant today. And so I say I give this 5 stars, and I do because it was such an incredible experience and I love her so much. It's also just hard to read because you just realize how everyone around her has failed her so much. Everyone who wronged her and all these people who have failed her and done what they have done to her for their own personal gain rot in hell because it's so messed up, and it still enrages me to this day. That's an entire rabbit hole you can go down, but honestly, I listened to this on audiobook and I believe it was narrated by Michelle Williams. She just did such an incredible job really capturing Britney's essence, really embodied her spirit, I feel, and just gave a really emotional story. So I just loved it. I love Britney forever. So next we have a book that I'm not going to mention too much because I did talk about this series already, but this is specifically The Ballad of Never After in the Once Upon a Broken Heart series. This is the second book. This is by far the best book in the series. There's something in this book because I feel like a lot of people agree. It's just very heavy on the jacks. Need I say more? That's all it really is to say about it. Next, we have another fantasy. This is The Elements of Cadence duology, and I gave both of these 5 stars. This is by Rebecca Ross, the same author who did Divine Rivals. This is a fantasy that's both kind of YA and adult, I feel, and I say that because you get 2 different couples in this. Among this overarching kind of fantasy plot, there also is some romance plot, but it's one younger couple and then an older couple. And I really enjoyed getting that kind of dual perspective of their different times in their life, their different struggles, just how things are different, kind of in young love situation and then an older couple. This fantasy world is just so rich. The descriptions and the setting in this is so magical, very ethereal, very atmospheric. This world is Scottish inspired, so there's a lot of Celtic folklore, history references in this. Obviously very fantasy based. Definitely inspired. I'm not super familiar with the actual lore and history of this region, but honestly, it just gave the best cozy fantasy vibes. I also really loved the magic system in this. While I feel like it was a bit underdeveloped, I will say very much elemental magic, which you guys know I love. So magic is rooted in fire, earth, water, wind. There's also a lot of magic rooted in music and bards and things like that in this. So I personally really loved that. I thought it was really unique and interesting way to go about it. I just feel like this was a really well written and again, very atmospheric read. I think this would be perfect for the winter. Also love that it's a duology and that it didn't get dragged out into a trilogy because I just feel like with fantasy trilogies, so often one of them falls flat. One of them is not really needed to be there. And I feel like this duology is just such a perfect example of why a duology can work so well, especially in fantasy. Really beautifully written, really well executed, and I really love them. Okay, we're down to the final 2. These are also the next 2 that I own physically, and they happen to be my favorite books of the year. So I'm very glad that I own them. This was hard to choose between the 2, but they're very different types of books. So you guys might have seen that I recently read John Steinbeck's East of Eden. Just one of the most powerful book reading experiences that I have had to date. I expected to love this because I did enjoy reading John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath when I read it in high school. But like you can see, I tabbed this up. There's just so many good quotes and themes in this one. So if you're not aware, as the name suggests, East of Eden is inspired by the story of Cain and Abel from the book of Genesis in the Bible. So it's a very religious inspired text. And as someone who is not religious, who still appreciate the beauty and the messaging of that, these characters are so rich and so interesting that I was just engrossed in this the entire time. To be honest, I took my time with this. It took me a while to get through because I really wanted to savor it. Essentially, this is set in Salinas Valley, California, and it basically takes place between like Civil War times and then through World War I. So very pivotal, very tumultuous time in American history where various people from all walks of life, all different places, a lot of people are immigrating to the country and trying to settle in California and build a life and settle and create something successful for their family legacy. So you're getting multiple families in this. It's a multi-generational story, which I love. I love a bunch of different characters. You guys know this. And it was just incredible. Honestly, an incredible reading experience. A lot of themes of, as you would expect from a biblical kind of inspired text, good versus evil, free will, family relations, especially fatherhood. Just really incredible. I have been thinking about this since I finished it. Just explores so many different facets of the human experience, of love and family and suffering and trauma. I just thought it was an incredible book. I am so glad to say that I have read this and I absolutely loved it. So that's East of Eden. Okay, y'all, we are down to the final book. My favorite book of 2024. Can anyone guess? I'll give you a moment. Another Greek mythology, that is Clytemnestra by Costanza Casati. This was absolutely my favorite read of the year. I, again, have been thinking about this one since I finished it. It reads so beautifully that I was just floored by her talent, honestly. This is such a beautifully written book. It's so well done. The characters are so interesting. You can really tell that Costanza Casati did her homework. She knows her shit when it comes to Greek mythology. This book, Clytemnestra, is the epitome of we support women's rights and wrongs. Everything that this woman did was justified. It was deserved. Everyone who wronged her deserved what they got, and I support her to the ends of the earth. I just absolutely loved reading this story. Clytemnestra is such an interesting character. People really did her dirty. And it's just a story of her trying to navigate that, fiercely protecting her loved ones. She's a mother, she's a sister, she's a wife, she's a queen, a leader. So if you're not familiar with Clytemnestra's story, she is kind of often in mythology considered to be a murderess, a conniving, kind of vengeful person. Honestly, when I was reading this book, it just reminded me of that clip of Taylor Swift. If a man does something, it's strategic. If a woman does something, it's calculated. You know, a man can react. A woman can only overreact. That's giving this because it was deserved. Everything she did was justified. I'll say it again. Clytemnestra is the half-sister of Helen of Troy, and she was married off young to Agamemnon, who was the king of Troy. So she grew up in Sparta. Young girls in Sparta are trained to be independent and powerful warriors. They learn to fight and train and spar, and so they grow up very differently than a lot of the other young women in different areas. So you get both perspectives as her as a young woman in Sparta growing up with Helen, and then later on in her life after an insane amount of trauma and people backstabbing her and taking advantage of her and doing all the things that you would typically expect from a patriarchal society in Greek mythology. Everything imaginable that could have happened to her. And so she got her vengeance. She did what she felt she needed to do. She was not going to be walked all over. She took what she wanted and she protected those who were loyal to her. And I just thought it was an incredible story of what it means to be a woman, a mother, a sister, a leader, and the settings in this one are just so gorgeous, so well done. Very excited. I think her next release comes out next year titled Babylon. One of my most anticipated reads for 2025. I am so excited for that. definitely my top for the year. Go read it. That is it, everyone. Thank you so much for sitting here and listening to me yap about all of my favorite books of 2024. I would love it if you would subscribe to the channel, like the video if you enjoyed it. Hope you all have an amazing Christmas if you celebrate, a happy new year. Hope you are safe and sound. I, again, really appreciate you being here. So I'll catch you in the next one.